Welcome back. We are going to learn something that is fundamental across all types of coding languages. So this is not something that's exclusive to SQL or BigQuery. This is something if you were coding in Python or R or any of your other big languages that you would use. So it's very fundamental, very important. If, then, what? So we are going to learn if-then logic or conditional logic. For our time budgeting, this is a really power-packed module. When I started, like the previous one, I thought I would be able to get through it quickly. I decided to just make this one a super packed one. So this first module that you're in right now, this is going to take about 15 minutes. We're going to go over what is conditional logic. Part 2, we're going to go through an example using if-then and what we call case logic. And then in the last one, you're going to get some practice using all of the different things that we've learned up until this point, including the items that we've introduced in this module being our conditional formatting. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the coding logic. Let's go over a couple of the different types, and then we'll zero in on what we're going to focus on in this module. You have sequence. Sequence is what you can imagine step by step. So you do 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. All of the coding that we've been doing up until this point has been sequence, if you think about it. First, we select our columns from our table, where we filter, different things like that. That's your sequence. So you've already been doing that. You didn't even know it. The next type that we have is conditional. Conditional logic is super important in every single coding language. This is not something that's unique to BigQuery. It's something that's going to be a common thread throughout every coding program. What conditional logic says is it's how to handle certain decisions. So we put in rules for our program to say, if this is what happens, this is what I want you to do. If this happens, I want you to do something else. So however you want to set up the rules, that's called conditional. There's also something called loops. Loops is something that you really won't see too often in BigQuery or SQL languages unless you get really advanced. Loops is very common in your Python and your R type of coding. That's something that you do when you have a similar type of task and you want to do it multiple times, but you don't want to have to keep writing the code out one by one. And the last type is error handling, and that's how we deal with problems in our code. Again, you won't use this in BigQuery specifically, but we do use certain things like safe divide or safe multiply to prevent errors from happening. This module, we're going to zero in on this conditional logic. Conditional logic is super important, so make sure that if it feels a little shaky that you go through this module 1-2 times until you feel really confident. And if you're still struggling, drop a comment on the video and I'm happy to help. Let's go into a deeper dive of what conditional logic is. The most basic type of conditional logic is called if-then logic. And you might already have an idea of what it is, especially if you've done anything in Excel. So this might also be called conditional statements, conditional formatting, or if you're in the SQL world, case-when logic. As we mentioned, every language has some type of this if-then logic, and this is a fundamental that you need to know. If-then logic is the same in Excel as it is in BigQuery. So you've probably done an if-then statement at some point in Excel if you've done any work in there. I also went ahead and Googled how would someone explain conditional logic simply. And I found this explanation on Quora that I thought was really good. So this person, Irene Bernard, they said it's quite literally logic formulas, i.e. combining yes/no values and branching depending on their result. And then this is how they wrote up their logic branch. So if I have some value, then do this task. If it's not that value, else do task 2. And then you end with task 3. Let's look at what conditional logic or if-then logic looks like in Excel. So imagine I have this column D, and I want to create this column C that, based on the number of passengers I have, I want to determine if this is a car or a van vehicle. So you can imagine if you're a driver for a taxi cab, that's 1 seat. A car will have 4 other seats, 3 in the back, 1 for the passenger. Anything bigger than that probably isn't your typical 4-door sedan. You're probably looking at a van or a larger vehicle. So we want to put our cutoff at 5. If I have less than 5 passengers in the vehicle, I want this to be classified as a car. If it's 5 or more, then I want it to be a van. In Excel, what you would do is you would start with the equal. That starts any of your formulas or your logic. You type if starts your conditional statement. And we say if this column here is less than 5, I want it to say car. Otherwise, I want it to say van. So looking at this, I can see in this first row, the value of passengers is 4, so I want it to be car. The next one is 3, that's less than 5, that's also car. Once I get to 5 passengers, now I flip from car to van. Let's look at this in BigQuery. You'll see that this is exactly the same logic. So we have our select, we're picking our columns. If, same thing here, if my passenger count, if this column, if the value is less than 5, I want it to say car. Otherwise, I want it to say van. And I want it to end as vehicle type. One thing that I will note is that this car and van, you see they have the double quotations in Excel. In BigQuery, you can do single quotations or double quotations. A rule of thumb is if you just always stick to double quotations, if you're flipping between Excel and BigQuery, then you never have any issues. And so this would be the outcome. And we can see that the logic is exactly the same. The numbers aren't exactly the same because I am actually pulling from our taxi trip data, but we can see when you have a passenger count of 5, it's van. When it's 2, it's car. So let's break this if-then logic into an even smaller piece. So here we have our passengers and our vehicle types. So this is the data that we have, our passengers, the vehicle type, that's what we want. So whenever you're starting your conditional logic, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, what do you want to do? Well, I want to create vehicle types based on how many passengers are on the ride. So if my passengers are less than 5, and this matches my outcome, what do I want to happen? Then I want it to be car. So you always start with if whatever my logic is, what happens if that's true? That's then car. And then you also have to define what happens if that's not true. And when we say not true, we just mean else or otherwise. So what happens if your data doesn't match your outcome? Well, then I want it to say van. If-then logic is really great if you have 2 options. You're either A or B. If you want to say you're either A, B, or C, it gets a little more complicated. And we'll go into that in the next module. But if you only have 2 options, if-then is a great choice. Let's compare something that is unique to SQL, and that's called case when. Case when is exactly the same as if-then, but the formatting is a little bit different. So we know with if-then, we have if our condition, what happens if that's true, what happens if that's not true. With our case when logic, very similar. So first we type in case. Case starts the logic. This lets BigQuery know, oh, we're going to do conditional formatting. What's going to happen? What happens when, or this, we could switch this to if, when passengers less than 5, then car, else van, end. And you have to, with the case statement, you have to have all of these components. You have to have case to start it, when, your condition, then, and then the end. This else is technically optional, but best practice is to always include it. Your next question might be, why would I do all these steps when my if-then is really good? And it's simple and I already know it. We'll go into this into the next lesson, but case when gives you opportunity to do multiple statements, whereas the if-then, you're really stuck to just the A or B. So with that, let's open up our BigQuery console and get some reps under our belt practicing if-then and case when. Okay, so here we are with our taxi cab data. Our first task, we want to convert vendor ID into a text description, where vendor ID 1 is called Creative Mobile and vendor ID 2 is called Verifone. You might say, where did I come up with those crazy names? I certainly did not invent it myself. But if I open up my table, doing my control click, and I go to my vendor ID. The description of vendor ID is a code indicating that the LPEP, don't know what that is, not relevant for right now, provider that provided the record. So if you're 1, you're equal to Creative Mobile, and if you're 2, you're equal to Verifone. And so what we're doing is we're saying, okay, I know how the data has it as 1s and 2s, but 1s and 2s don't mean really anything to my human brain. If I convert these 1s and 2s into what the vendor is actually called, that's something that my brain can stick to and makes more sense. So we're going to use if-then logic to flip these vendor ID numbers into what their name should be. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is let's select vendor ID, and we're going to try that if-then logic. If vendor ID equals 1, then I want it to say Creative Mobile, comma, else, what happens if it's not equal to Creative Mobile? Well, in this example, you can either be Creative Mobile or you can be Verifone, and those are only options. So if it's not equal to 1, then we want it to be equal to Verifone. And then we're going to relabel this. What are we going to call it? Instead of vendor ID, we're going to call it vendor description. And let's try that. Okay. So now I see I have all these rows and I have this vendor ID and all I can see is for 1. Let's get rid of these duplicates and let's just look at our unique ones. Because I want to make sure that when vendor ID equals 2, that it's doing what I need it to be. So if I say select distinct, distinct kills duplicates, and that should just give us 1 value for vendor ID 1 and 1 value for vendor ID 2. Perfect. So this is how we do our if-then logic using the if statement. What if we wanted to do the conditional logic using a case statement? We can do that. We'll do case when vendor ID equals 1, then Creative Mobile, else Verifone, and as vendor description case. Now what we would anticipate is that this should be exactly the same. There should be no differences. Seeing is believing, so let's go ahead and run this code and see what happens. Perfect. So I can see using the if-then statement is exactly the same as the case when. You'll notice though that this if-then looks a little cleaner. It's 1 line versus this case where I have it spaced out and it takes up a lot more room. So if you're just doing A or B, if-then is usually your best bet. Case we'll cover in our next lesson is really good if you have more than just your A or B options. Error, but it's just something that keeps coming up. Okay, so that ends the demo here. Let's jump back to the PowerPoint and wrap up this lesson. In today's lesson, we introduced and learned conditional logic. We know now that you can activate conditional logic using an if or a case statement in SQL. Regardless if you use if or case, they both have the then and the else keywords. What then does is it tells us what to do if the criteria is met. Else is a catch-all to say, if my criteria is not met, what do I want to do with the ones that don't meet that criteria? What do you want me to do with them? If requires a then and an else. Case requires when, then, and end. Technically, you do not need an else. You can throw that out, and anything that doesn't meet the criteria, it will return a null value or a missing. Best practice, though, is that you should always have case, when, then, else, and end. You should have a spot for everything. Okay, so that wraps up this first part of this module. In our next lesson, we're going to go over the case statement and when we have multiple types of criteria. See you then.